Hi, I'm Trish Tagle and this is Trish Time. And today on our show, our guests are Giordano and Amy Albam from the Cornell Cooperative Extension. Hi guys.
How are you?
Hello, Trish.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Nice to see you again. We did have a chat prior to this show, but let's first talk about your backgrounds and how you came to the Cornell Cooperative Extension.
Well, I actually came out of the nursery industry. I actually went to school for English literature and philosophy and psychology, and then much to the dismay of my parents, I went to work for a nursery when I got out of school.
Okay.
So from there, I ended up at Cornell Extension. I applied for the job and got it 25 years ago.
But what was it about, because you said you were an English major, and then what was it about the nursery that you decided, hey?
Well, yeah, it's not like I didn't have a history with plants. I mean, I used to follow my mother around the garden and watch her plant things, and my grandfather had a big garden in the backyard, so, you know, I was always into it.
Okay, so it's from a natural interest then that you went to the nursery and started.
I would say so.
Yeah. And how about you, Amy?
Well, the same thing. I followed my mom around in the garden when I was a kid, and my grandma always had a big garden, and she canned all the tomatoes she ever used.
Wow.
And a lot of other food, so that was my interest. But I worked in the graphic arts industry in a camera room most of the time, and I just loved being outside. So I became a master gardener with Cornell Extension, and then I was hired as a diagnostician after that.
Wow, that's amazing. So can you maybe just tell us a little bit about what a master gardener is?
A master gardener is a volunteer who is trained by Cooperative Extension to educate the public about gardening. So they get research-based information training, and then they go out and they do projects and education throughout the communities.
And you have various programs at the Cornell Cooperative Extension. Did you want to talk about some of them?
Well, one of the things we do a lot of is diagnostics. We have a lab there, and we do walk-in diagnostics where people come in on a Tuesday and a Thursday from 1:15 to 3:15. We accept samples through the mail, and people also just drop them off. We do a lot of work with the commercial industry, and we try to be available for them for their needs, you know, when problems come up in the landscape.
And we're talking, when you say commercial, talking about golf courses, those types of...
And especially landscapers. The landscaping industry in Westchester is huge. It's a $1 billion industry.
Yes.
And also arborists. Arboriculture is big here too.
So
We have call-in hours for homeowners as well. We take commercial calls at that time, but our 9 to 12, Monday through Friday, we have our phones open for homeowners. And so we answer their questions about gardening, whether or not they should bring a sample in for a diagnosis. We also do structural pest management, so we identify insects and problems they may see inside as well. And as far as the master gardeners, they go out and they do Q&A tables at events and farmers markets. They have a speakers bureau. They have a lecture series, so they do a lot of things.
There's a whole ton of things,
Site visit program, and many demo gardens, or a number of demo gardens. Our big demo garden for vegetables is our Hartsbrook Park and Preserve in Hartsdale.
Yeah. So prior to this, we did talk about the soil and the concept of bottom up. Did you want to discuss that?
Well, many people don't realize how much depends on the soil. Soil health is really key in maintaining plant health and also helping plants get through stressful periods. One of the things about the Northeast is that we don't have a lot of topsoil here. The soils are very thin. We live on a worn-down mountain range. We're not out in the Midwest where you have several feet of topsoil sometimes. So when you plant, you really have to amend the soil with things like compost.
Are there, okay, so you're talking about intervention then. What are the different ways of intervention with regard to, you know, improving the soil, besides organic matter, like you talked about composting? Like, what are the other ways that you can improve the soil?
One of the issues that we see here a lot is clay soil.
Yes.
And clay soil can be good because it holds nutrients and it holds moisture, but the particles are very small. So if it gets compacted, it doesn't have air, and roots need air as much as they need water as well. So if it gets compacted, the roots are limited and can't make their way to find nutrients and moisture. So loosening up clay soil is very helpful.
Yeah, I did notice, because I have trying, not very successfully, to grow roses in this one area. And you're right, the soil, I did notice the soil was very compacted, and not many of the roses are surviving.
That's one of the plants, especially if you're not just growing one of the landscape roses. You really have to do some amending there. Pretty much you dig a trench that's about 2 feet deep and maybe 2 feet wide. You take the soil out and you mix it with 1 part compost and 1 part soil. You could also do 2 parts compost. And then you put it all back in the hole and you set your plant.
So is this a good time to do that, though, because we're going fall into winter? Is this a good time to do that, or should I undertake
really.
that?
Spring.
Roses would be best in spring when they're before they've started to grow. Some plants you can plant now. You can divide some perennials, especially those that have started in the spring, flowered in the spring. You can plant deciduous material, that the trees and shrubs that lose their leaves. You know, they'll go dormant. They won't have the leaves on. You can plant some needled evergreens now successfully, and some others as long as you have a very protected spot for them.
And you talked a little bit about trees, and there's this concept of trees being social in nature, which I've never heard before. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, basically trees in this area really have evolved to grow with other trees. Turf is inherently restrictive to root development. Where it comes to trees, they fight for nutrients and moisture. And when trees are in the forest, they live in a duff of collected leaves that are on top of the soil with microorganisms, etc. And they even graft, roots even graft onto each other from other trees. So when you take a tree and put it in the landscape and surround it with turf, you're doing something that aesthetically we like to do because we create gardens, but it's inherently not the way most trees want to grow.
Oh, that's really interesting. But how do you, okay, again, we're going back to this is what we do. Well, what's the solution then to having a lone tree?
Organic matter.
Organic matter, and choosing a tree that can handle open conditions, because there are some that do that. Some of the evergreens, some even of the broadleaf trees can handle wind and exposure better than others. So if you choose those that do, you'll be more successful. In the case of a real forest tree, like say an ash tree, the act of putting it in a lawn is a stress. And when stresses build up, then diseases and insects become more of a problem.
So is a maple tree a broadleaf?
Yes.
Okay. So it's anything with a literally a broadleaf.
A broadleaf that falls off is a deciduous tree. A broadleaf that stays on, like a rhododendron, would be a broadleaf evergreen.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I'm sure people are not they don't have the expertise that you do.
Well, the other thing you can do is continuing with what Amy said, is you can create an area around the tree that's as wide as you can tolerate and just mulch the tree instead of having turf there. You know, 2 or 3 inches, not too close to the trunk, but to keep the soil moisture in and the weeds down, and also to keep the roots from having to compete with the turf.
That's really interesting. I actually have a neighbor that he he kept this one tree, but he built like it's not a fence, but a border around his tree, pretty wide, and there's mulch there now. He just moved in. And I asked him, I said, why did you do that? Just out of curiosity, because he's changing his landscaping. And his reason to me was because he didn't want to do as much work because he had to mow the lawn. But I'm thinking that maybe the company that he's working with that did this actually was thinking about what the concept that you're saying is actually putting the mulch there so that it creates a better environment for the tree.
Right, yeah, mower injury is another stress on trees. A thin bark tree, it can cause a wound that diseases can get into. So keeping the mowers away is a good thing to do as well. You can also build a bed with a few trees in it that will act as a larger area for rooting as well.
And of course, one of the worst things that sometimes happens is trees end up being too deep. They're deeper than they were originally planted, and that bark tissue is not meant to grow below the soil. So if they sink, or if you're not paying attention, you can end up with real problems. We saw that recently on a site visit. You know, tree roots go out about twice the height of the tree.
Oh, really?
People don't realize that. So
now we do.
It's a big area.
Wow. Yeah, there was a time when I remember that on my property, I had a tree, and it fell over because there was too much rain, and it just wasn't holding as well as it should have, and it fell over, and I kept asking for it to be replanted, and it wasn't done. And then finally I asked someone else to replant it, and they put it quite deep, so the tree did not make it, needless to say. But that's the whole thing is there's a certain limit.
Yes, when the tree develops, it develops tissue differently for the roots than the above ground parts.
How deep should it be? Like, this is the root, this starts to be like the trunk.
The base of the trunk, what's called the root flare, the wider area that attaches to the roots, should always be visible.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, so it's
the volcanoes up around the trees are very damaging. They can cause rot. The reverse is true as well. If the tree is too high, then the roots are exposed. We don't see that quite as much these days, but it is something we run across occasionally.
The roots of the trees, though, do they go deep or do they go wide, or is it
wide?
Wide.
Really,
wide?
only right near the tree they go a few feet deep. Really, they're in the first, 10, 12, 18 inches of soil, but they spread out very far from the tree.
So, okay, this is like very interesting to me because I have planted quite a number of trees myself. And I'm sure a lot of other people have planted, and they're not necessarily inexpensive. I always thought that the roots went to where the water was. Deep.
In our area, we have rock that comes up pretty high. So a lot of our, as Jerry said earlier, our soils are thin to begin with. So in the Hudson Valley, definitely, in a lot of areas in the Northeast, the roots are mainly in that top 12 to 18 inches, and the feeder roots that take up the nutrients and support the tree are really in the top 8, 10, 6 inches of soil, depending on how much soil there is. They go out wide, and that helps tension to hold the tree up. There are some anchoring roots, but the majority of them are at the surface.
And also, sometimes the deeper you go, the less oxygen there is.
Right.
They want to be where there's oxygen and moisture. So.
That's really fascinating, because I always thought that they sought out water as deep as they could go. So would you suggest that people water their trees, water the land, you know what I'm saying?
The drought, yes.
Yes,
that's the really, the turf you can reseed, but you really should give your trees,
enough.
They need about an inch a week inclusive of rainfall, and you have to water a wide area. So if you can do it, if there's no drought restrictions, that's one of the things you should do.
Yes, without overdoing it, because you don't want to drown them either. Roots need air to respire just like we do, as much as they need water. So when you see all those surfacing roots in the lawn, often it's because it's too wet and the roots are coming up looking for air.
Huh. That's like, this is really, really fascinating, because like I said, I've planted several trees, and now I'm going to be looking for the roots to see, like, maybe I'm overwatering, maybe I'm...
And if they go into the ground like a telephone pole, you know it's too deep, because there's no root flare.
I'm definitely going to be checking for those. But you mentioned before, like, you know, I think you're referring to death by 1,000 cuts. Was that that's what you were referring to with regard to the lawnmowers?
Right,
cutting?
the lawnmowers, the too much or too little moisture, the excess mulch or not enough, exposure from wind or sun if it's something that really likes shade, or shade if it's really something that likes sun. There are lots of different requirements that different types of plants have. So choosing the plant that's best for the site is very helpful. It's much easier than trying to make the site adapted to the tree you want.
And there's also, okay, so some people have regular trees, like let's say a maple tree, that doesn't necessarily bear fruit, and some people plant trees that do bear fruit. Now, there's a difference with regard to how to maintain or fertilize these trees, correct?
Well, fruit trees, you'd obviously have to pay more attention to the nutrients that are in the soil. Usually we recommend a soil test if somebody's going to be planting a fruit tree. And of course, you know, you can't possibly amend wide enough for a tree. So you want to select a pretty good site for a fruit tree if you're going to be doing it. Wouldn't you agree?
Right.
But there's also, okay, so people like me, who are not experts like you, we would think, oh, I'm fertilizing the tree, it's going to bear fruit. But the truth of the matter is a different story, right?
Yes, we don't actually recommend fertilizing woody plants anymore, shrubs or trees, because you just push them.
Yeah.
What do you mean by push them?
Well, you cause them to grow more than they want to. Trees don't really want a lot of nitrogen to begin with, so that makes them more prone to insects and disease.
It also could promote leafy growth over flowering and fruit. So while there are some times when fertilizing a fruit tree is useful, you have to be very careful not to overdo it.
Right. I was talking more about landscape trees. And, you know, that's one of the common things we see, really, is people over-fertilizing.
What, so for fruit trees, though, because there are people, again, who have fruit trees, what kind of fertilizing would you recommend? Is it dependent on the type of fruit?
It's dependent on the soil test.
Oh, okay, we're back to the soil again, which already started. So, okay, so give us an example for a fruit tree. Just any.
You mean a fertilizer?
Yeah.
I think 10-10-10 is what Cornell recommends most of the time. And again, it's based on a soil test. We don't usually tell people nutrients are not a big issue in Westchester soils in most places. That's another reason. But the soil test tells you if you have things that are lacking, and then you know what to add. You really shouldn't indiscriminately fertilize when you're doing fruit trees.
Okay. Do you suggest fertilizing at all? Because you just said that, you know, Westchester is pretty nutrient dense. So
for fruit trees, I would say you might need it.
You might.
You could go along and see how you did also. You know, you could do a wait and see method if you don't want to.
Right. That was my thought, is to use the growth as your guide.
I mean, because with fruit trees, you're expecting something that you can eat, so it's a little more important.
Yes, that is true, unless you just really like the way the tree looks and you don't really mind whether or not it bears fruit. I do have a plum tree. I've never seen a plum. But it's pretty, so it doesn't matter to me whether or not I get a plum out of it, ever.
You might need 2 plums in order to have cross-pollination.
Really? Is that really what it
Sometimes,
is?
yeah. Sometimes. Some plums are self-fruitful, but even those, often they'll fruit better if they have another one.
It's the social aspects of the trees and them needing.
And knowing what the tree needs.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. So, okay, we're going to talk about the weather because a lot, we've heard a lot about, global warming and all of this. So how are we doing this year with regard to our weather and drought situations?
Well, we are in a moderate drought right now. Some of the state is worse than we are, but we're in a moderate drought, and we had a summer with high temperatures. I think at least 3 to 4 degrees higher in Westchester, and during August, I think it's 1 to 6 degrees higher across the state. So that's when all of this prep comes into play.
We had unsettled weather actually the past few seasons, but this past last fall was very dry and warm. We saw plants flowering out of season. Then it got very cold. Then we had another warm spell. So it's very hard for woody plants in particular to keep up. And even the perennials, some of them were flowering out of season, which is unusual.
Yes, I do remember that.
And that's kind of what you meant about the 1,000 cuts, because issues with trees especially are cumulative. You might not remember the drought from 3 years ago, but the tree remembers it.
So is there anything, obviously global warming, we should all be doing our part with regard to recycling and all of that, making sure that our energy consumption is lower. We all know that. But is there anything, we can't control the weather for the most part, but is there anything that we can do for our plants though in these types of situations?
Well, it's kind of what we were saying. What this type of weather does is it highlights the places where you've not done the soil prep, where you're growing in hard, compacted soil. Those are the plants that are going to respond negatively first to these issues.
So what you're just talking about now brought up another question in my mind. And it goes back to my roses, sorry. But I'm sure, like I said, there's roses, whatever other plant. How many times can you dig up a plant and replant it? How many?
That depends on the plant, too. Some plants are easy to move and others really don't like it. But the more you move it around, the more you're disturbing it and the harder it is. When they grow up plants in the nursery in a row and they dig them up and put them in a ball and burlap container, they're leaving probably 95% of the feeder roots in the ground when they do that. So the plant has to come to the new site and develop all those new roots before it really gets established. So that really takes a few seasons, even more than a year or so. And people often don't water after that first season when it would be helpful a few more maybe. But every time you move it, you're pretty much doing that same process where you're leaving a majority of the roots in the ground that feed the plant. So it's better to decide on a spot and leave it there. But we're all guilty of moving things around.
Are you speaking from personal experience?
Unfortunately, yes. Yes. Especially, like I said, with the roses, because I was trying to find an area for them. And now, like I said, with your advice, I'm thinking of digging it up again and doing the layering. But then, should I not?
If it's really in a bad place, it would probably help it to do that again. And people can call us if they want to know the best place to put something, or if a plant is going to be working in a certain situation, or we do have lists of plants that would work in different types of environments. So those are all things to do your research first as well. Everyone, I think, who is really into plants comes home with something and they have no idea where they're going to put it, and they have to find a place.
Everybody does
and that's another thing. But if you can do your homework in advance, often it works out better.
Okay. So, guys, this has been really interesting. I think there might be a part 2 here that we could talk about, because obviously there's a lot more information that you have that the public should actually know. So thank you very much both for being on the show.
Thank you.
So this is at the end again of another episode of Trish Time. If you go to the website link that should be showing below, there's a tip sheet there that might help you if you're interested in gardening to figure out what it is that you need to do and what are the steps and when you should take these steps. We wish you all the best, and we'll see you again on Trish Time. Thank you. Bye-bye.